Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Be Curious LATES event, Pioneering Pandemic Research. A live transcript will be available for this event, and that will be posted in the chat in just a moment, so you can follow along with us if you need to. My name is Alex Holmes, and I'll be your host for tonight. I'm a PhD student in the Faculty of Biological Sciences at Leeds, and I'm very excited for tonight's event, not only because of the subject, but also because this is the first in our winter series of Be Curious LATES events. In each one, we invite you to take a peek at what goes on inside a university with a little help from 3 University of Leeds researchers. Our speakers are connected by a theme, but we try our very best to make sure you hear from different researchers in very different subject areas. Speaking of which, tonight we'll be exploring just some of the pioneering pandemic research, they put that in there just to be a tongue twister for me, that's being undertaken at the University of Leeds. We're going to be looking at tackling loneliness, investigating the impact on children's development, and addressing the many challenges of long COVID. We'll hear how tonight's speakers are applying their expertise to investigate the impacts of COVID-19 and come up with solutions to support society's recovery. Each speaker has just 10 minutes to tell you about an area of their research, and after that, we'll be inviting questions from you, and maybe a couple cheeky ones from me. If you have any questions for a speaker, just post it in the chat, which you should see to your right or your left of your screen if you're viewing the event in YouTube. If you want to participate in the live chat, you'll need to sign into YouTube using your Google account. But if you want to just follow along, then that's completely fine. I'm glad that you're joining us. So, for those of you watching along from LinkedIn, we'll keep an eye out for your questions as well and keep them asking. But when I say we, I mean our moderator team. So that's Erica and Andy, and they would absolutely love to say hello to some of you this evening. So let's give it a quick try now and we'll have a warm up. So give us a hello in the chat. Let's see where you're tuning in from in the world. I'm currently in very rainy Leeds. It looks like we have a G Montgomery joining us as well. And I think the rest of us are in Leeds too. So while you're all saying hello, I'll start introducing tonight's speakers. So we have Dr. Manoj Sivan, who will be telling us all about long COVID, Dr. Kat Davies, who will be telling us about children's development, and Leanne Shearsmith, who will be telling us about loneliness. So first up, I'd really like to welcome Dr. Manoj Sivan to tell us all about long COVID onto the screen. Hello, how are you?
Hello there. Hi, Alex.
Brilliant. Well, I'll hand over to you.
Joined us.
Yeah, we'll take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you all, as I said, for joining. So this is 8 p.m. In Leeds, so I'm sure you're all quite excited to listen to this topic at this point of time. I'm going to be. I'm just going to. Are my slides up, Alex?
No, they're not showing just yet. Some technical issues, but that's always the case on a live stream, isn't it? I think you need to move your screen so that it goes onto your PowerPoint.
Is that okay now? Can you see it?
Yes, that's perfect. So present a view and you're ready to take it away.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about our project, which is called Locomotion, the Long COVID Multidisciplinary Consortium Optimizing Treatments and Services Across the NHS. I'm Manoj Sivan, Associate Clinical Professor and Consultant in Rehab Medicine. So what I do is our specialty looks after people in terms of those who have long-term conditions. So we are particularly interested in the long-term effects of COVID. In the first wave, we were looking after people with acute COVID in hospitals, and when they started being discharged from hospitals, we found that patients did have persistent symptoms at discharge, and some were getting readmitted. So we were very interested in knowing about the long-term effects. And we have done some world-leading research, actually, and we continue to do so in Leeds. We were the first, actually, to do a follow-up study of patients getting discharged from hospital and to pick up these long-term symptoms, eventually, which got coined as long COVID. And then I'll share some of our other work as well in today's presentation. So I'll keep it very brief because we've got only 10 minutes. Locomotion project is an NIHR funded project, 3.4 million given to us. We are a consortium of NHS sites, and universities working together to tackle this problem and to establish a gold standard of care across all the four nations. So, what is long COVID? So, very briefly, any persistent symptom which individuals recovering from COVID experience beyond 4 weeks is called long COVID. This is a term which is given by patients, really. So, as I just said, when healthcare professionals were very busy tackling acute COVID, these patients who were getting discharged from hospital and those in the community, they were really struggling with persistent symptoms, and they got together. They coined actually the term long COVID, and then they've driven the whole research in this area. So I think full credit to actually the patients for coming up with this and driving this piece of work. So it is a constellation of symptoms. It's a syndrome with various manifestations, as you can see on that slide. It could be taste and smell disturbance, headache, visual disturbance, muscle pain, joint pain, abdominal pain, diarrhea, loss of appetite, fever, fatigue, palpitation, chest pain, breathlessness, and then the psychological symptoms of anxiety, depression, PTSD. So every individual is different. They present with different combination of these symptoms, but in general, this is a multi-system condition which affects all the kind of the major 10 organ systems, and we've got at least 205 symptoms listed in terms of what has been reported by patients with long COVID. The scientific term is post-COVID syndrome, which is used beyond 12 weeks, and that's the terminology we use in terms of the NICE approved terminology. So the slight difference is long COVID is 4 weeks and post-COVID syndrome is 12 weeks. So those are some of the figures, just for reference, that roughly around 20% of infections, they have symptoms beyond 4 weeks, and it drops to about 10% beyond 12 weeks. So that equates to roughly more than 20 million worldwide, and we've got 2 million in UK alone. So what the project is, so it's basically led by University of Leeds, and we've got seven other universities working in partnership with us: Oxford, Imperial, Dundee, Manchester, Leicester, and Oxford Brookes. And we've got 10 NHS sites across the four nations. And the work we'll be doing is that. So long COVID needs management in the specialist long COVID clinics. We've got 83 of them, which has been funded by NHS England. So what we want to do in this 2-year project is to look at what's the best way of managing this condition. We will arrive at best practice guidance by sharing our views and knowledge in these 10 sites. And we will bring that knowledge to primary care, which is the work stream 3, as you can see, and apply that knowledge. Because if we have 2 million people depending on 83 clinics, it's very difficult. It's going to be difficult for these clinics to manage that sort of workload. So we want to make the system efficient, that what we learn in long COVID clinics, we bring it to primary care and for self-management in people's homes, which is the work stream 2, where so that people are not actually dependent on actually the specialists, but manage their condition themselves. And also when they hit primary care and GP surgeries, their condition is managed right there at the time of presentation, rather than just being referred on to a long COVID clinic and waiting. So at the moment, there's a huge bottleneck with people waiting months and months just to be seen in a specialist clinic. So this piece of work will standardize that care and actually bring care to people's homes and to primary care. And there are different work packages and tasks within those 3 broad work themes, which we can go in detail in just a minute. So that's the quality improvement collaborative, what will happen in long COVID clinics. There's a learning cycle of people sharing their knowledge, how to manage, for example, blood clots, how to manage dysautonomia, palpitations, racing of the heart, and then the other symptoms I mentioned, including the psychological symptoms. Because it's a new condition, we've got to learn it by just sharing our experience and deriving at best practice guidance. So that will happen in workstream 1. We want to address health inequalities, because at the moment, long COVID clinics are being accessed primarily by the affluent, and people from deprived communities and ethnic minorities are not accessing the service. So we want to find out why that is the case and try to involve them. Now, return to work is huge because what we're finding at the moment is you have the middle-aged individuals with more than 50% of them actually inactive work, struggling to go back. So we need to come up with some vocational rehab programs to address that. We in Leeds have developed the world's first outcome measure for long COVID. It's called the C19YRS, which has won numerous awards this year. And that is available on a digital format, which will be rolled across the 10 sites, and we will further develop it. And it is basically an instant monitoring tool for patients on the app. And then the clinicians can see them on a web portal and actually talk to the patients and manage them live. So this is a digital system which is currently used in more than 30 NHS trusts, not just in these 10 sites of locomotion. And care pathways, I talked about this. How can we make it more efficient? How could we actually work with primary care, secondary care, with different disciplines actually working together? Because as I said, this is a condition where it's a multi-system and it's about 205 symptoms. So we need a range of specialists working together. And for the first time, NHS is seeing actually this cross-cutting management in integrated pathways where different specialists, cardiologists, respiratory physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, speech and language therapists, us, rehab, all working together towards managing these patients, which we've not seen before actually. So we're very excited about this integrated way of working. And as I said, we have won some major awards, including the BMJ award. Actually, we were the clinical leadership team of the year this year, and you'll be surprised to know that we actually managed to beat the Oxford vaccine for this prize. I'm not sure what great stuff we did, but clearly the judges saw that we've done something very unique, which is much more far-reaching, almost same as probably the vaccine. Thank you.
That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. Maybe it's just me being really ignorant, but I didn't actually realize that it was the patients that called it long COVID and actually kind of spearheaded it being an area of investigation. So that was really interesting.
Yes. So I think, as we all were in the first two waves of the pandemic, it was all about saving lives. So, and I think that's the right thing we did. We were focused on that. We couldn't save all the lives, but I think, people were really focused on pooling all the resources towards that. Whereas the patients were getting discharged, they were still struggling with symptoms, and there was no follow-up. There was no community services geared up. I mean, it's all different now, but those days it was all left to them. So I think they, started a Facebook group, and then there was a long COVID support group, and they just, in millions, because it's worldwide, it's a problem. So they got together, they started saying that, well, this is all, these are the symptoms we have. They came up with the term. So I mean, full credit to them, really. And then the scientific community picked up on this once the first two waves settled down.
No, I think it really just shows the power of us all being connected and how much we can communicate with each other now. We do have a question from the audience as well. So we got one from Steve Smart, who wants to know, are there any other lessons to be learned for other conditions? Because a lot of other conditions do have chronic symptoms like chronic fatigue, systemic lupus.
Yeah,
Can we apply this to others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So chronic fatigue for years has not got its attention, really, because it's always kind of very controversial topic, and not many services and even healthcare professionals actually truly believing in the condition. And I think suddenly long COVID has given that kind of recognition to these conditions, because it is now, we know that what is happening and what we are seeing are definitely genuine, a post-viral multi-system syndrome, and we are also looking into the mechanisms which are actually driving this. So now we understand better about this condition, and now that knowledge has to be applied to these other conditions as well. And I think chronic fatigue syndrome will be definitely managed in a much different way now, given what we know from long COVID.
Yeah, I was thinking that as well, since there seems to be such an emphasis on like the psychological symptoms, like the depression, the anxiety. and those have been kind of neglected. So it's quite nice to see those really represented in the data you want to collect about long COVID.
Definitely, and I think what we're seeing is a real mix of the biological problems, the medical problems you see, as well as the psychological symptoms. So I think in the past there was quite a lot of stigma attached to this, that it's purely psychological. But what we're seeing is this genuine sort of biological alterations and problems which probably are driving this. So it is completely understandable. So when you see people having the psychological distress, because there is kind of the physiological processes actually driving this.
Actually, we haven't rehearsed this, but that so perfectly leads me on to the question that I wanted to ask you, which is, do we really understand what's causing long COVID?
So, I mean, we are still looking at the kind of the various theories, but the closest to what we believe is actually there is this immune response which happens in the body to the virus, and it is exaggerated in exaggerated, or it's sort of it's dysregulated in some individuals, and it is not kind of resetting to normalcy, and that is linked to the autonomic nervous system. And definitely we are seeing a lot of palpitations and alterations in the autonomic nervous system. So that clearly is driving many of these symptoms. And then there is also a direct damage of the virus to the organ systems. So it's a combination of all these. Now, every individual, as I said, is different. The manifestation is different, and that is because I think the mechanisms are also slightly different in each individual. But it's in general a combination of these measures. So the immune response, the dysautonomia, the organ damage, and obviously the psychological distress. So the psychological symptoms can be argued that it might not be just purely the result of the kind of the viral damage. It could be other factors that, obviously the pandemic response, and then isolation. We have another talk on isolation tonight, and the impact it has on people's work and relationships. So that obviously has an impact on the psychological issues as well. But clearly we are better understanding the sort of the biological sort of responses which are attributing to these symptoms in this pandemic.
Yeah, no, I can completely see that. I think there's so many different ways your body is impacted by a disease. I imagine, the health anxiety of it as well could really easily contribute to those. I am going to ask one final question. It's a bit cheeky of me, but if people have more questions, put them in the chat, and I'm sure Manoj will answer them. But I just want to ask, you mentioned the health inequalities and that affluent people seem to be the ones accessing these clinics. Are there any ideas for better ways to cater to people that aren't being reached?
So what we are trying to do in this project is we are trying to actually use contacts, so the kind of the snowballing technique, and we want to actually get in touch with those people. We certainly know, I mean, even like kind of colleagues and friends, we know a lot of people who are actually not accessing these clinics, um, and they are struggling with symptoms. So we are trying to come up with ways of actually getting in touch with them, finding out what are actually the barriers. Is it a system problem, or is it a belief issue? Because it could be that culturally maybe the belief system is not there for actually medicalizing these symptoms and then getting referred to a clinic. So we really don't know. We want to understand, well, what essentially are the barriers. Is it kind of a culture related thing, or is it a system and a service related thing? And we want to address it. So in the locomotion project, in these sites, we want to understand these issues and then address it through peer support, and having sort of seminars, webinars, and workshops for patients, for healthcare professionals, how we can change the services and the attitudes of healthcare professionals so that these people actually access the services. Because at the moment it's is worrying actually in terms of the number of people from these communities accessing these clinics.
Yeah, I think there's such a theme to this of listening to what people need. So listening to the patients reporting these symptoms, trying to listen to people and work out how best to engage with them and help them with these. I think that's a really good point. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I'm sure there will be more questions in the comments for you shortly, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Kat Davies, so I'll bring her up onto the screen now too. Hello, Kat. You ready to follow that?
Yeah, tough gig, but I'll do my best.
I have full faith in you. Well, I'll hand over to you. Off you go.
Can you see my slides?
Yep, can see them.
Brilliant. All right. So I'm Kat Davies. I'm an Associate Professor in Language Development at the University, and tonight I'll outline what was happening in early childhood education during the pandemic and what effect that's having on children's developing skills. So I'm going to talk, if I can, on two projects tonight. The first focuses on children who were between birth and 3 years old at the start of the pandemic, living in diverse backgrounds. And on that project, we looked at a wide range of factors relating to COVID. So their early years education, their cognitive development, their family mental health, sleep habits, all sorts of things. And I'm going to focus on their early education. The other project is the ICL project, the impact of COVID on key learning and education. And this one, it measures the impact of primary school disruption on children just starting out at school. So still little, but a little bit older than our social distancing and development kids. So a bit of background to start off with. We know that going to high quality early childhood education and care, I'm going to refer to that as ECEC, can produce positive cognitive and language outcomes at age 5. And that's especially the case for disadvantaged children. And that's really important because it suggests that ECEC can narrow that gap in attainment between disadvantaged kids and their more affluent peers. So why is this? What can nursery and other childcare settings do? Well, we know that they can protect against certain risk factors. Those risk factors might be structural, so economic stress, environmental stress around housing, for example, or individual risk factors, so lower parental education, less stimulating home environments, for example. Nurseries can really make a difference there. In the first project, we focused on the links between ECEC attendance during the pandemic, on the children's socioeconomic background, and their development of language and executive functions or thinking skills. So in language, we're interested in how many words they could say and understand. And executive functions, we looked at two types of these. So cognitive executive functions, that's their ability to focus their attention, to think flexibly, to solve problems, to come back to what they were doing after being distracted. And those skills are all really key to a range of later outcomes, including academic success. On regulation, this is the child's ability to calm down after being angry or frustrated. And these skills are really important for social relationships and for other behavioural outcomes. So we asked our cohort of 189 families to complete online tests about their use of ECEC, about their socioeconomic background, and about their children's growth in language and thinking skills. So all our kids were typically developing under 3s from monolingual English-speaking families. So we know that at the end of March 2020, when the pandemic hit, settings were closed to all children except those of critical workers or those classed as vulnerable. So that meant that only 5 to 10% of children who normally went to early years education did so during that March to June period in 2020. Now, after that initial period, there was this extended period of quarantining measures that's still ongoing, of course, that reduced attendance and overall increased disruption. So it was important to us to investigate the effect of that disruption on children for two reasons: to track the wider effects of the pandemic, but also it was kind of an opportunity for us to measure the value or the difference that early years education was making as we were sort of given that chance where it was not accessible to huge amounts of the population. So we asked this question: how were the cognitive benefits of ECEC that I just talked about, how were they affected for those kids who continued to attend settings during the lockdowns? So there were two possible outcomes to this. One is that those kids who continued to attend because of their vulnerable status or key worker status continued to access those benefits. On the other hand, those benefits might have been reduced because of that ongoing disruption around, cleaning routines and staffing shortages, etc. So here's the results of our outcome measures. So on the left, you've got language. On the right, I'll reveal this is the thinking skills. And this is plotted against the number of days that the children went to ECEC. So we split our sample by high and low socioeconomic status. So the blue line is for the disadvantaged children. The red line is for the advantaged children. So you can see here on the left, The top panel is the words that they understood. The bottom panels is words that they said. So you can see overall, because these lines slope upwards, that the more children went to nursery or other settings, the better their receptive vocabulary was. So that means, in real terms, that a child who went to nursery 1 day a week could be expected to understand 24 more new words over that spring to winter pandemic period than their peers. A child who went 2 days a week could be expected to learn 48 more new words, and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly, that effect was purely driven by children from lower SES backgrounds. So these kids showed greater increases in the numbers of words that they understood, the more nursery that they went to. The children on the red line here, these are the richer kids, more advantaged kids, just made the same gains that we would expect them to make as they got older. We see a trend in the same direction for expressive vocabulary, but that wasn't quite significant. On the right here, you've got our executive function skills. Now, again, you can see a slight slope going upwards here. So this is our cognitive executive function. So that kind of management of attention, etc. So again, the more the kids went to ECEC during the pandemic, the better their cognitive executive functions got during that period. Now here, background didn't matter. So no matter, how affluent or not your family background was, the more that you grew in cognitive executive functions, depending on how much nursery you went to. At the bottom here, this is regulation. We didn't see any relationship there between nursery attendance and regulation skills. So just to sum up this part here, our results really echo what we already knew about the benefits of ECEC, that children from less affluent backgrounds who benefited more. Now, the implication of that is that those who lost access during the pandemic were disproportionately disadvantaged by our social distancing measures. They missed out on the benefits that they really should have got should they've been attending. On language, as I said, that those from disadvantaged backgrounds really grew more. And why is this? Well, we know there's a whole range of research that showing that home environment really affects the amount of speech that children hear, the quality of the speech that they hear, the kinds of turn taking that they encounter. All of these are really important for a child's language development. And those differences have been linked to financial and structural inequalities, which have been deepened during the pandemic. Hence, the increased importance of nursery as a protective factor to, provide that kind of lexical diversity in language to enable the children to thrive. On thinking skills, as I said, we see this boost in cognitive skills, no matter what your background. And we think that's because of nurseries providing really rich learning environments, really rich adult-child interactions, for example. Now, pre-pandemic, the question is, why doesn't that vary by economic background? Pre-pandemic, we would expect that more advantaged families would be more able to provide that kind of rich stimulation. But interestingly, from elsewhere within this project, we found that for a variety of reasons, those more advantaged families just weren't able to stimulate their children in the same way during the pandemic. So we see these benefits of nursery across the whole of the kind of cohort. We also measured the effect of informal childcare. So once restrictions started to be lifted, when support bubbles were introduced, basically, people were using family members as childcare, as usual. Now, we didn't see any boost to language and thinking skills from using informal childcare, and we'd like to dig into that a little bit more deeply later on. So that's the first project. Moving on to the ICL project now. So these kids, remember, are a little bit older. So these are kids who were in reception, so 4 to 5 years of age at the beginning of the pandemic, which is the first year of formal schooling in the UK. So we wanted to document how disruptions in school or out of school during home learning impacted children's progress. So we took data from 10 primary schools in Leeds, and we asked teachers and parents and carers to provide information for us. And we looked at what the schools were providing, what the children were doing at home, and then how the children progressed. And we collected data at 2 time points. So one was asking about the first period of school disruption in the spring of 2020, and the second was looking at the second period of school disruption earlier this year, so January 2021. No time to kind of dig into the detail tonight, so just some kind of top level findings here. So on the first, on engagement with home learning. So children in reception made less progress than usual than we would expect while they were home learning. And worryingly, up to a third made no progress at all in key areas of literacy and maths. Sorry, I should have said that we looked at a range of different kind of curriculum areas. So we looked at the early years foundation stage profile, which is phonics, literacy, maths, personal, social and emotional development, and communication and language. So just flicking back here, we see that up to a third made no progress in those key areas of literacy and maths. Now, those were linked to known risk factors, so social disadvantage, special educational needs. But here we find a new inequality as well. So children who were more able to engage in home learning, thanks to, space at home or access to devices and technology, parental supervision, those made better progress during the pandemic in their learning. So our recommendations for government here, for the Department for Education, were that homeschool partnerships were really important here. Families were needed to be supported in supporting their children. So that homeschool communication was really important. On remote provision, we found that schools that provided a wider range of resources made more progress. And likewise, children who had access to physical books as opposed to online books made more progress in reading. So again, our recommendations from our research were that the more resources, the variety of resources really helped the children to progress. And bear in mind that these kids are really quite young and that, they're not going to be able to learn independently. So setting them up on a screen or with an activity to get on with themselves is not really going to work for very long when you're 4 or 5. So we would appeal to the government to support schools in providing alternative to screen-based learning and to really, again, to support those caregivers to support their children. We know that certain profiles of children suffered more during the pandemic. So one of those would be children with additional needs. So we found that children with a formal diagnosis of special educational needs made less progress, but also those children without a formal diagnosis, but who normally had additional classroom support, made less progress. So our recommendations here would be for increased investment in teaching assistants, to develop a bank of differentiated resources. So children of different ability levels would have different tasks to do, and to be supported with individual or small group interventions during remote learning. Children with English as an additional language also made less progress in reading than their peers. And for those kids, it's really important to ensure that they had continued access to hard copy English books and the opportunity to read aloud in English, perhaps over video calls. So there are sort of top level findings that from the first period of lockdown. We're just writing up the second round of data collection. So here's a bit of a sneak peek of what was different between the first and second lockdown. It was really different the second time as the eligibility widened for children. Occupancy in school went up, so from 5% in the first lockdown to 33% in the second, and in some schools that was about 50% occupancy. Schools, there was an introduction of statutory obligations and expectations about what the schools would provide for remote learning, and they would be supposed to be comparable to what children in school were receiving. So things look really different here. And parents also told us that there was much more reliance on technology. Google Classrooms was being used, different kind of Zoom interfaces for kids to check in regularly, to submit work online, etc. They needed to do that, which had implications for families without those kinds of devices. The schools also provided more structure. Prescribed times for working, different kinds of tasks, which helped a lot of families in knowing what they were doing, but also raised expectations and in many cases caused quite a lot of stress for families who are dealing with multiple children, jobs, illness, and everything else that the pandemic brought. In terms of pupil progress, we found the same kind of predictors in the first and the second lockdown. So those kids who were doing better before the pandemic continued to do well during the pandemic. those whose families were able to engage in home learning did better. Older children did better than younger children. Children from more advantaged backgrounds did better. Those with a special educational needs diagnosis didn't do as well. And those who needed additional support, as I said, didn't do as well. Now, we found that across the lockdowns. In that second lockdown, when attendance was much bigger, much greater, those that attended school, unsurprisingly, made better progress across the curriculum areas. So very broad brush details there. You can read all of the details in our reports, which are available on our website now. And as I said, the final reports will be available in a couple of weeks' time. So just to finish up by saying thank you to all the families and schools contributing to our studies, to the ESLC who funded both projects. This was a big team effort, this one. So for the social distancing and development study, this is our team here. We're based at various universities around the UK. The ICL team are here down the side. We're all based at Leeds. So thanks to my wonderful collaborators as well. Thank you very much.
That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I don't have children. I don't really know anyone that's like school age or nursery age. So I've kind of been aware of things that are happening, but not actually looked at it in that much detail. So that was a really cool talk. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
We already have an absolute ton of questions. So I think I'll start you off with Sadie's first question. So you're talking about children going to nursery and learning kind of 24 new words in the first kind of season.
Mm-hmm.
My face dropped, Alexa's face dropped, Sadie's probably dropped as well. So can children catch up from that?
So those children that weren't
didn't
given that
learn the
opportunity. Yeah. I mean, you see huge variation, when parents, so I run the child development unit at the university, and parents often ask, whether their child's ahead or behind. And, especially around the age of 2 to 3, well, particularly at 2, you just get this huge variation in vocabulary size is one measure. So yes, children kind of spike at different periods of development. So yeah, we would hope that with the right support, then children would catch up. But of course, it's that Matthew effect, isn't it, of the rich get richer. So for those children who lost out during the pandemic, lots of them wouldn't have recourse to that kind of extra stimulation, extra resource in many different types at home and elsewhere. So you start to see this kind of the gap widening, unfortunately. So yeah, if the kid is, well equipped, they will probably catch up. Unfortunately, those that haven't got quite so many resources would have a tougher time doing that.
Yeah, I think you can see that quite clearly in your graphs, those kind of lines just diverging. It really shows you that something, the government needs to take some kind of action. It's really nice that this can feed into that kind of action.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking to ministers all along about so things like improving the take up of funded places, which is not nursery places. It's not an easy system to navigate. We hear about the 15 hours, the 30 hours, but it's actually quite a bit more complex than that. So yeah, we've been making recommendations through policy leads and other partners in really making that easier for parents, because we've shown here just what a difference early years education can make.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, that really nicely leads on to a question in the chat from G. Montgomery. So saying, many families aren't eligible for the 30 free childcare hours. So is this making the case for greater funding and access?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you'll have heard about the kind of discrepancy between what it actually costs to run an early years setting and what the government's subsidies are, and those don't meet. So yeah, there's ongoing work calling for a sustainable early years sector. And the frustrating thing is that it's actually a really cost-effective way of helping children. If we kind of, lay those foundations at the beginning, then you save a lot of money and effort later on. So I'm not sure if I've answered that question properly, but yeah, I mean, there's the Sutton Trust, a range of other kind of third sector and other stakeholders are lobbying, have been lobbying, to be honest, for years for a sustainable, properly funded early years sector. And actually with proper protections and training and pay for these really highly qualified educators. I refer to, as early childhood education and care. And we thought at the beginning of the pandemic that, this is the chance to really show that, nurseries are not just, nappy technicians, as I've heard it called. These are, highly qualified teachers. So to show people that it's not just the kind of childcare function, but actually an early years education. Unfortunately, a lot of the political discourse has been about getting families back to work rather than what it can do for their children. So yeah, that's another ongoing fight we're having.
Yeah, but hopefully this is kind of a flashpoint in that it's made it so clear that this is so valuable that action can be taken. And actually, something you said there is linked to a question that I wanted to ask you. So you kind of made this point for the primary school children in the ICL project, which I just love the name of, that actually there's all these other things that school gives you rather than just, the resources. And in nurseries, what other things are they getting from being in a nursery environment?
Good question. Yeah. So consistency of care, highly qualified practitioners, less screen time, the time around other kids as well, time around peers, doing all of that kind of social navigation of sharing and turn taking and communication and that kind of thing, space, toys, outside play areas. I mean, from a different part of our project, we really saw a socioeconomic difference in the first, the very harsh lockdown when parks and libraries were shut. And for those families who didn't have access to outside space, who didn't have a garden, for example, or didn't have books at home and couldn't go to the park or the library or to nursery, those children just weren't getting that stimulation.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point, and kind of links to what I think Sadie's other comment about the benefit of having physical books and cutting down on screen time and these kinds of things. I think that's a really good point. Actually, Alexa was asking whether or not watching telly with subtitles was a good substitute, but apparently it's not.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked at again, a related project looking at the amount of screen time across a number of different countries during the pandemic. No surprise, screen time goes through the roof. And of course, as well as it's not the screens themselves that are the problem. It's in many cases what it's stopping the child from doing otherwise. So, linked to physical health as well as cognitive issues as well. Yeah. And I think ebooks are great. I'm not saying ebooks don't work or that we shouldn't be using them, but sometimes they can be a little bit distracting with buttons and bells and whistles going on, where when you've got an adult doing shared book reading with a child with a physical book, we know that leads to really kind of rich language and rich interactions.
I completely see that. Well, thank you so much for answering all of our questions and, well, at least giving me a bit more of a background of what's going on in that area. So thank you so much, Kat, for that.
Thanks a lot.
Cool. We'll bring up our final speaker for the evening, which is Leanne. Hello, Leanne.
Hello.
Welcome to the main stage.
Thanks very much.
How's it been waiting in the green room and seeing?
Oh, it's a very tough act to follow from Manoj and Kat, so a little bit nerve-wracking.
You definitely got this.
Thank you.
You definitely do. Cool. Well, we'll bring up your slides and we'll let you go ahead. Yep, I can see them.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Great. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Leanne and I'm a research assistant in the School of Medicine and Health at the University of Leeds. And together with a team of researchers from the universities of York, Keele, Manchester and Hull York Medical School, we've been researching loneliness and depression in older adults during the COVID-19 pandemic. We also worked very closely with Tees Esconware Valley NHS Trust and Age UK. So like the ICL project, it's a big team effort. So I want to start by asking you to remember the last time you felt lonely. It might have been a kind of fleeting feeling, or it could have been a persistent feeling on a particular day, particular place, or a particular time in your life when some specific change happened, like moving to a new town or a relationship ending. And if everyone shared the last time they felt lonely, our experiences would be completely different. And that's because loneliness is subjective. It's not as simple as being physically alone. It's the experience of feeling like there's a difference between the quantity and quality of social relationships that you have and the quantity and quality that you desire. So why do we need to worry about this? Well, loneliness is associated with an increased risk of depression, and this risk can persist for up to 12 years after the loneliness is reported. Chronic loneliness has been likened to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and that's for its association with poorer physical health, depression, and dying prematurely. None of us are immune to feeling lonely, but there are some people who are more vulnerable to it than others. And aging is a known risk factor for loneliness and social isolation. Life events like retirement, divorces, bereavements, and long-term health conditions can cause network sizes to reduce and leave people feeling socially isolated. In older adults with long-term health conditions, loneliness and depression is detrimental to physical health, quality of life, and some research suggests can increase the chances of dying from those long-term conditions. Loneliness also causes additional pressure on health and social care services, and reducing social isolation in older adults is currently a priority in the government's strategy on loneliness. And targeting this worrying combination of long-term health conditions and depression in older people was something that our research team were working on when COVID-19 hit. As part of a study called MODS, we had developed a bespoke intervention for depression in this population, and we were all set to start recruiting in spring 2020. But then on the 23rd of March, the pandemic was declared, and the UK government and World Health Organization instructed everybody over the age of 70 or with a health condition that made them clinically vulnerable to COVID to stay at home and avoid all face-to-face contact with people outside their household for at least 12 weeks. And we realised that our vulnerable older adult population would now be a lot harder to reach. But we also anticipated that these social isolation measures would have a significant impact on people's lives and on their mental and physical well-being. And this remains an ongoing issue as we emerge from the pandemic. And we do know that people's lives are still very much disrupted compared to before the pandemic. And don't just take my word for it. There's some quotes here from interviews that we did with participants, reporting kind of loneliness, isolation, and not being motivated to do things. So our question was, can we deliver a brief psychological intervention, which was behavioural activation, or BA, to older adults who are vulnerable or shielding? Is it feasible to do this remotely? Is it an acceptable intervention? And can we go as far as preventing or reducing depression and loneliness? And we called this the Behavioural Activation in Social Isolation, or BASIL study. And we were given urgent public health status by the government, as the BASIL study was in response to COVID-19 and was considered to be urgently needed to address the mental health impact of the pandemic. BASIL was one of only 2 urgent public health studies focusing on mental health in the UK, and having that status allowed us to do our research when many other research studies were paused. And so yeah, we're really proud of this work that I'm presenting you today. And we were also helped by a group of older people with lived experience of long-term health conditions and or depression, and through our kind of patient and public involvement work. So thanks to them as well. So why behavioural activation? What is it? So behavioural activation, or BA, is a type of support, and it's based on some very sound psychological principles. It's been around for many years, and we know from research that we've conducted and research conducted by others that it works very well for older people in preventing and treating depression. And BA works by focusing on maintaining people's daily routines, because we know that what people do influences how they feel. And when people's daily routines are disrupted, then there's a danger that they move into levels of inactivity and they lose the positive reinforcing aspect of everyday life and become low in mood or depressed. So in Basel, older adults were given a self-help booklet and offered up to 8 phone calls with a support worker. And we trained those Basel support workers to help the older adult work through the booklet, tackle that loss of routine and that loss of social contact by scheduling activities, finding alternatives to the things that they weren't no longer able to do, and maintaining daily schedules. We knew that BA works for older people in certain situations, but we didn't know whether it would work in the context of COVID-19 and shielding. So to begin to find out, we conducted a FAIR test called a randomized controlled trial to decide whether this is an intervention that is acceptable and could be potentially used in the global and the NHS's response to COVID-19. And this slide shows what the randomized controlled trial looked like. So we recruited older adults to the study from June to October 2020 from their general practices in the northeast of England. We randomized them into the study, a bit like flipping a coin. They had an equal chance of being in the intervention group or receiving usual care with some information about health and well-being. We followed them up at 1 month, 3 months and 12 months and interviewed a small number to get an in-depth understanding of their experience of taking part. And here's what we found so far. So the results from this small study called a pilot have just been published in a scientific journal, and 96 older adults, which we refer to as participants, were recruited. And an important part of whether a study works is whether you can recruit and retain participants throughout the study. So we were delighted that we got really great numbers of people staying engaged with the study and completing their follow-up questionnaires. Rates above 90% in mental health trials is a really big achievement. People engaged well with the BA support intervention, so people really liked the booklet and completed a good number of sessions. From this information, along with interviews that we did with participants and support workers, we can say that the Basel study was found to be acceptable and feasible, and the early results suggest an encouraging signal of effect in the ability of BA to reduce the levels of loneliness in this vulnerable population. And here's some quotes from the people who were involved in the intervention to show what aspects of the support they valued the most. So you can see we've got some people kind of looking at how it kind of made them reflect and look at their life and how they do things, and people like the activity scheduling and things like that. So it's good to get some kind of in-depth feedback from people as well. So what's next? Well, while it's reassuring and interesting to see that we can deliver an intervention to older adults during the pandemic, we can't be certain of whether BA is effective in reducing depression and loneliness until we test that out in a much larger trial. And that trial is currently underway. We've called it Basel Plus, and we're aiming to recruit 600 people across England and Wales. And we've recruited over 350 already. The Basel programme is by some stretch the largest ever trial of a behavioural intervention ever undertaken to tackle the problems of loneliness and social isolation. And feedback from older adults and support workers who did the intervention suggested it's valuable in getting people to talk about how they're feeling, and just generally being a really big benefit to people. So thank you to all my colleagues who've helped deliver the Basel trial. Thank you to all the people who participated in the Basel trial and COVID research in general. And thank you everyone for listening to it, allowing me to share our work with you today. We're on Twitter for updates, and you can visit our website for more information about the study, and I'm happy to take questions now and by email. Thank you.
Brilliant, Leanne. That was so interesting. And I think a lot of that will have definitely resonated with us over this year. Those quotes kind of towards the beginning of people describing their loneliness. I was like, oh, yeah, over the past year, I've definitely felt some of those. And Sadie also was quite...
God, I was saying yes.
Oh, no, I was just saying that, yeah, both me and Sadie were quite shocked at the comparison to smoking.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we know loneliness isn't a new issue. It's been going on for so many years, but actually everyone going into lockdown and being isolated, experiencing what these kind of vulnerable populations would experience kind of day to day, has really kind of helped kind of that public awareness and really kind of open up that conversation about loneliness and mental health, things like that.
Yeah, because I kind of remember that John Lewis ad a couple of years ago of the guy on the moon, and that being really hard hitting, but not quite getting it until actually experiencing that ourselves. So I can definitely see how that's impactful. Yeah, we've got a couple questions in the same kind of vein from the people behind the scenes and also someone on LinkedIn, which kind of asking, do you think the survey itself kind of acted as an intervention against the loneliness as well?
Yeah, I think to an extent, just judging from some of the interviews that we did, I think taking part in the study really helped older people to feel useful. Because when people were shielding, obviously, we had our kind of frontline workers, and it was kind of a big effort to volunteer and to help. And older adults were kind of just obviously shielding; they couldn't do anything. They felt really useless. And some of the feedback from participants was that they liked being part of something. They really wanted to help. We actually, yeah, a lot of the participants who took part just wanted to do something and feel useful. So yeah, I think had its benefit, but
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and particularly what you're saying about having a routine. Part of having a routine is you go do something and are useful. So taking part in a survey kind of fits into that, I think. Um, we have a question from G. Montgomery. I'm not entirely sure what some of the acronyms mean, but could this model be incorporated into IAPT services which use BA or in social prescribing?
yeah,
Hopefully you know
so
what IAPT is.
yeah, so this is improving access to psychological therapies, and
Brilliant.
yes, so yeah, I think encouraging access to psychological therapies. I guess older people don't often access these kind of services. There's also kind of a, I don't know, older generations often don't even talk about their mood or don't see this as an opportunity. Well, they don't talk to their doctor about low mood or how they're feeling. And yeah, I think that's a really good point from the audience about using it as a model, because BA is very much kind of already used in core mental health services. So part of the reason why we kind of train support workers from different areas across kind of disciplines was so that we can kind of scale it out and use some of the kind of people who worked in IAP to kind of deliver an intervention like this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's like integrating it into the existing services. And it's
Yeah,
interesting what you said about kind of older people not really talking about their moods. This might link into Lorna's question. So I think also there's that kind of stereotype that men don't really talk about their moods. So they're wondering if women benefit more from the behavioural activation, just based on their own anecdotes.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. So incidentally, in the 96 participants who took part, it was 62% women, which perhaps says something itself about women kind of taking up the offer of a support or kind of research. Our study wasn't adequately kind of powered to really test to split it up by gender, but perhaps kind of looking ahead to the main trial, where we've kind of got much bigger numbers, we could perhaps see whether there's anything in terms of gender there. Thank you.
No, that's really interesting. We have one final question that I'm going to have to wrap up. I can tell people like want to keep talking about this. Do you think you'll notice differences in how people respond to BA in different areas of the country or different socioeconomic backgrounds?
That's a really good point, and I'd be really interested to see if there
I'm
are
sure that could be a
differences.
whole other talk.
Yeah. So in the main trial, when we selected our sites, so we are doing it 11 sites across England and Wales, and we really carefully selected those sites to try and get a broad range of different socioeconomic background, different ethnicities, to try and ensure that BA can be kind of applied and see how people respond to it. I think in terms of kind of the principles of BA, we'd hope that it was accessible to everyone, because it's about improving kind of the activities and daily scheduling. So we kind of would hope that in theory it would be accessible, but there are people doing entire PhDs on adapting BA to different cultures or groups. So really interesting kind of area to explore.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like something you could definitely discuss with Manoj, with his access to his clinical interventions as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Leanne. That was really, really interesting. And I'm glad you made loneliness kind of an exciting and interesting topic. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, that brings tonight's event to a close. I want to thank again all of our brilliant speakers. That was Dr. Manoj Sivan, Dr. Kat Davies, and Leanne Shearsmith. I had a great time hearing about the pioneering pandemic research going on at the university. If you did too, please do let us know by tweeting at us. So you can find us at Uni Leeds Engage, and you can use the hashtag BeCuriousLates. And you can also fill in a short evaluation form. There should be a link on screen in a moment, and it will be posted into the chat for you. Let us know what you think of these events, and that can help us keep improving them for you. And if you've not had enough of virus research and research being undertaken to meet the challenge of viruses and pandemics, I would wholeheartedly recommend tuning in to the Royal Institution Christmas lectures. I personally know he's going to be brilliant because one of my friends is working on them, so shout out to Ophelia. The University of Leeds itself also has a friend working on this, and that's our Professor Kath Noakes. She'll be joining England's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, and 5 other experts to take a deep dive into the science of viruses. So Kath has done a huge amount of things during the pandemic and applied her knowledge to understanding the transmission of COVID and the importance of ventilation in reducing the risk of transmission. So these lectures will be broadcast on BBC4 and iPlayer between Christmas and New Year's. And if you enjoyed tonight and want to join us again, we've got our next Be Curious Lates event on February the 2nd. That'll be 2022 now. We'll be hearing all about design and discovery from scientists and engineers based in the Bragg Centre for Materials Research. So we can finally have that shout out to Andy Lee. So feel free to register for your free ticket now. The link should be about to be posted into the chat. And keep an eye out on our website for any other upcoming Be Curious Lates. All of these are free to attend, and I would absolutely love to see you there. So that's all from us here. I hope you have a great evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Bye.